Hello, I'm Sanjay Jogia, wedding and portrait photographer and Canson ambassador. Today I want to speak about the importance of printing, in particular printing your clients' albums. So without further ado, let's get going. So we have to ask ourselves the question, why do we photograph weddings? Well, it's for a number of reasons. It's to help create a legacy for our clients, their children, and their family history. It's for ourselves as well. It's for us to leave a mark on the landscape of our existence. But it's also for us to earn a living and support our families and our future, and the future of the industry as well. This legacy begins by creating something memorable, to create a keepsake, a family heirloom. The album is the heirloom, as is wall art. The components of the album or the heirloom, whichever one it is, should be quality, storytelling, consistency, originality, and creativity. Let's just focus on the quality for a moment. We're not just talking about the quality of the piece of paper or the print. We're talking about the quality of everything that finalizes as a print. The quality of your production, the quality of your talent, the effort that you put into it, the post-production, the print quality, and the paper itself. So let's first look at the effort that goes into creating that quality art. It's important that you spend some time and actually manage the expectations of your brides and grooms. You set the scene, you set the stage. You create a seed for them to build upon. And that seed should allow them to understand the value of the imagery and the photography, and then the final print as well. That seed will grow the more you spend time discussing your approach and your work, your ethos, and the importance of printing as well. So I'll speak about a couple of images of mine, in fact, and I'll run through how I've created them. And these are the sorts of stories I'll actually tell our brides and grooms so that they understand how much effort goes into creating these beautiful images. That also sets the scene for them in terms of why it's important to print, because they begin to understand the effort, the quality, the thought process, the talent, the energy, the emotion, everything, the blood, sweat and tears that we pour into creating an image, and how it's a travesty if these images are just left to sit in a hard drive somewhere, and when really they should be hanging on the walls or on the table in an album, and they should see the light of day. And these images should actually be growing old with them and their marriage, and should be developing with their family and growing with their family. The children should grow up seeing pictures of the mum and dad on the wall. They should grow up being able to see the wedding album and look back at photos of granddad and granny and the uncles and aunts and the cousins and friends, maybe even people who have passed on. So let's look at this image. This is an image from a Sikh wedding, and it's inspired by a moment in the Sikh ceremony. It's actually taken after the ceremony, but it's inspired by the ceremony. Any bride and groom would initially look at this and think it's part of the ceremony, and then they may consider that there are some people missing, which would normally be present in the ceremony, looking quite awkward, which is one of the reasons why I've actually created this image after the ceremony. Then I go on to describe how I place the camera, how I place a light off to one side and stagger the couple so that they're both illuminated. I'll explain how I expose for the light coming through that stained glass window, then balance the entire scene with the additional lighting. I'll explain how I'll frame the image in the camera so it's symmetrical and dead center. They'll begin to understand the thought processes that go on in a photographer's mind throughout the wedding day, not just during the portraits that I've shown here, but also during the photojournalistic moments, which I'll come on to later on. Then you have an image like this, for example, which looks very serene and peaceful, very romantic, until you explain what was involved in creating the image. It was actually taken from another boat, and I was actually there in the smaller speedboat with my assistant, who was lighting the front of the main yacht. Now, this yacht is the bride's family yacht, so it has intrinsic value to her, and as part of the narrative it has intrinsic value as well. I'll explain how the sun's behind them, and I needed to light the front of the yacht to create some separation, and then balance it with some lighting on the bride and groom as well. But also point out how choppy the water is, which means that both boats were being pushed and pulled around by the tide, making it extra difficult to take this picture, because you couldn't hold the frame for more than a couple of seconds without the whole scene changing, and you have no control over this. So to be able to create an image like this takes a lot of time and effort. And imagine if that image just lived on a hard drive or a USB stick somewhere and wasn't printed in an album or on wall art. It'd just be a shame. Move on to an image like this. Brides and grooms often think that this is photoshopped. Brides and grooms often think that actually a lot of the images that we create are photoshopped, but actually these images are created in camera, and we explain the value of in-camera art and the skill of in-camera art. Personally, I grew up shooting film, so I have the discipline of being able to create an image in camera. When you begin to describe these processes, the bride and groom have a new appreciation for photography. The time, the effort, the skill that goes into creating this. Then you explain how it is actually created. And in this situation here, you can see the bar in the background in the picture, which is what this is. You can see the metal glazing bars, which is what this is over here, which means I was photographing through this piece of glass here, which also meant we spent time moving the furniture around so that we could get into position. But then you tried to work out how the bride and groom are there. There's two of them, and they're slightly ghostly looking. Well, I explained to the bride and groom that the couple in this picture are actually behind the camera. So I'm shooting in this direction through the glass onto the bar from roughly where this couch is. The bride and groom is actually behind me, and I'm picking up the reflection on this piece of glass here. The double reflection comes from opening the door the other way, so you have two pieces of glass and two reflections. And that's how that works. Their reaction usually signifies that they had no idea that this was possible in camera. It signifies that they don't necessarily understand the skill, the creativity and the talent that goes into creating these images. And this is before we even talk about printing them. How about an image like this? This is also between the wedding and the reception, like the previous image. This is at the bride and groom's flat in London. They've come back to get ready for the reception, and we decided to do some portraits there. So I describe how my background is I'm an architect, and I have an appreciation for architecture and building design. I have an appreciation for the clean lines of this building, the modern look and feel. Their apartment was near the top of the building, so I figured I'd pose them on the balcony. I'd light them from above by mounting my light underneath the soffit of the balcony above. I'd trigger it using a remote trigger from the ground below. Now, but just imagine if you were standing on the ground below this building, you would be roughly here, looking up here. So then you'd have a big perspective effect on the building, which would look slightly awkward, maybe a little bit too dramatic, and you'd be shooting up to the underside of all the balconies and all the soffits. So then what do? We separate ourselves from the building. In fact, the bride and groom are up here, and I'm all the way over here with my camera on a tripod. And I'm directing the bride and groom using walkie-talkies. So again, your clients begin to understand just how much time and effort is involved in creating these images, how much skill, how much control, how much creativity, how much thought, how much planning, how much logistics go into this. How about this image? Again, a lot of couples think that this is photoshopped, and then I show them this video. This is actually in Iceland. After the sun had set, unfortunately, we had to wait for inclement weather to finish, and I showed them that this whole thing was created real life in a freezing situation. It was probably about -25. It was raining, as you can see in the picture here. We've used every light we had going, including the van headlights, and this image was created in camera. So they'll see the lengths that we go to create beautiful dramatic images. So we're really setting the scene and setting the context for how we work and what we put into our image making, the blood, sweat and tears. This is the same couple in Iceland. Different day, different location. And then we show them what's involved in creating it. We show them how cold it is with the way we're dressed up. Again, it was -25. But these are the hot springs in Iceland, area called Geysir, and we're using the steam from the hot springs to create drama, and we're illuminating this with 3 flashes. The third flash you can't see behind the stone, lighting up the smoke in the background, and it just shows what we go through to craft our storytelling images. How about an image like this, for example? It looks pretty straightforward. It looks like it could have been made on any normal day in a beautiful English countryside building. This is actually a beautiful school in an area called Stowe. And this colonnade has no lighting in it whatsoever. So then I explain to them what's actually involved. I show them on this diagram that that's the bride and groom. I've lit them from behind the column. So I've placed the lights carefully so you can't see them in the photo, because I don't really want to spend time photoshopping these things out. So we create the image in art, the art in camera. I place flashes behind every other column, and that shows them that I've really taken time to set the image up to create this beautiful scene that lights this whole colonnade up, which would have been in complete darkness otherwise. Now again, this was a dull, cloudy day, typical of the UK. So the sky would have been very flat. I've used graduated filters on my lens to try and extract some detail back from the sky. I may even show them the original picture with and without the lights so that they can see just how much goes into it. So it's important that you communicate your process, your ethos, your thinking, your ideas. It's entirely up to you to establish all of their expectations from the get-go, because this provides a framework, a grounding for you to be able to talk about the printing. And we'll talk about why printing is important in terms of making money later on as well. It's a vital part of our income as photographers. It's where a big chunk of our profit comes from. A lot of photographers may think that it actually comes from the coverage, shooting the wedding in the first place, but actually a big part of it is a print. And if you're not printing, you're leaving a lot of money on the table. You're leaving a lot of income on the table that could change your life, change your business. So, moving forward, this is actually the Iceland couple. This is on their wedding day now, and it looks like it's in India, but it's actually in the UK. We make it look exotic. We make it look interesting. We make it look like it's in a different place altogether. And that's our task. That's our job as photographers, as storytellers, to be able to create something that's unique, to create something that's beautiful. And again, we show them what's involved and how we illuminate the entire building and how we focus light onto them, how we create a pose that's respectful but close because it's at a temple, how we separate them from the background by placing a light behind their heads, none of which can be seen in the camera. Moving forward, same thing again. We have a bride standing in an alcove. The alcove has very little daylight in it. So what do? We expose for the foliage. We place the bride in the alcove because it frames her beautifully. But then we place some lights in front of her. One which is the key light on her face. The other one is actually just filling in the rest of her, the front of her body and her outfit, just to show off the pose, her beautiful form, her beautiful outfit and all the details. And it creates a very stunning, soft, but beautiful fashion-like image. I think people tend to imagine that these are very easy to create. If you challenge them to create an image like this, I'm sure they'd struggle. This is why it's important for you to really educate our brides and grooms in terms of what we do. And what we do doesn't just stop at taking the pictures. I always say there's 3 stages to what we do. The first stage is creating the image. The second stage is processing the image and extracting the best from it. And that's where a lot of photographers stop. The third stage is the print, the output, the finalization, the immortalization of the image. And that's our responsibility. And we have to take that forward. Let's talk about the grooms. Grooms often get overlooked. Sometimes simple portraits of grooms are the best. And in this situation with this groom, he had a very quirky character. And you can see that in his expression, I think, as well. But then we also explain how we've taken this photograph, because they all think it's taken in a studio, or we have a backdrop established on the wedding day. And often on wedding days, we're pressed for time, we're under pressure, we're stressed out, we don't have time to create these scenes and create, build backdrops and that sort of thing. Sometimes we do, but very, very, very seldom. So we show them behind the scenes photo and show them that this is just taken at the entrance of the hotel room that he's staying in, where the wedding was. And you can see from the picture that it's nothing more than a wall. The door behind him is acting as a slight reflector. And there are 2 lights in front of him, one as a key and one as a slight fill. The image was established as a waist-up image. So the spread of the lighting is sufficient at this stage. And we talk about that. We talk about how the image is set up to suit the concept. So now imagine these images in print. And this is something that this is a process we go through with our brides and grooms. We make them imagine these in print, because we'll begin by showing them a slideshow of entire weddings. Then we'll take them into another room, which is full of prints, full of albums, full of wall art. So now we're shifting their expectation away from a digital delivery to something that they'll cherish because they can see the physical print. So the question is, do you print? Do you show prints? You can only sell what you show. If you don't show prints, the bride and groom, they simply won't buy into the idea. It's impossible for them to imagine it, perhaps. So showing prints, showing albums is very important. If you don't print, you're leaving money on the table. If you do, then perhaps you could become more profitable. Perhaps you can streamline your approach and be more effective in terms of upselling that. Why should we print? Well, a photograph isn't complete until it's printed. And a wedding isn't complete until it's printed into an album. You have to tell the whole story. And earlier on we spoke about consistency and quality and storytelling. And the album is the opportunity to curate the images into a story that evokes an emotion. It's your job to tell that story and curate a set of images that are consistent. The consistency is important because consistency engenders trust. If a set of images, if your behavior, if your work is all consistent, they can trust in you. If all of those things are erratic, they'll lose trust. They'll lose faith in the imagery. They'll lose faith in you. They'll lose faith in your abilities. So consistency is key. Quality is key because ultimately they're paying for it. But quality is key because this needs to be timeless. They need to be able to enjoy these images in the albums in 10, 20, 30, 50 years' time. So it's important that you use quality paper like the Canson Infinity. I personally love the Rag Photographique. But it's important that you use paper that is archival. It's important that you print on good quality printers, like the Canon printer behind me, for example. Good quality inks that go with good quality printers, that print on good quality paper, will ensure that you're able to tell your story and deliver your message. It allows you to fulfill your promise as a photographer, as a professional. Ultimately, we're sitting there selling our services. But to what end? It's not just to earn that fee. You have a reputation to look after and to build. and to maintain. So it's important that in order to build and maintain your reputation, and also of the industry, not just yourself, that you deliver that promise. But it's also to help create that legacy we spoke about. This is something that the bride and the groom will cherish for the rest of their lives. It's something they'll pass on to their children. They'll pass it on to their children. It becomes the story of the family, the history of the family, where the family began, where the children and the grandchildren's roots came from. There may be people in the album that the children don't even know because they've passed on or because they live in different countries. So it's important to establish bonds through photography. I come from a story which is quite sad in that my mother passed away when I was 15. She didn't see me get married. And my father and my mother's wedding album is priceless to me because I only knew my mother for 15 years. I wasn't there, obviously, when they got married. And that album is very simple. It's nothing more than 6x4s printed and stuck in a ring-bound album with a double-sided page with a cellophane cover. It's a very simple album that probably cost very little at the time, but to me it's priceless. I couldn't put a value on it. I couldn't put a figure on that at all. And this is what will happen. And I'll tell you another story about a bride and groom later on. We print to eternalize the imagery itself. Because what use is creating beautiful award-winning images if they're just going to sit on a USB stick or on a hard drive somewhere that may even get corrupted, may even become outdated and outmoded. USB stick may work now. The plug may be different in 10 or 20 years' time. Whereas the page is the page. Once it's printed, it's always there for them. Once it's printed, that paper will age with their marriage. It'll age with that family. It'll grow with that family. We print to protect and support the industry. The print industry is half of our industry. It needs us to print, but we need it to survive. We need it to make more money so that our businesses survive, so that we can support our families, so that we can thrive. So how about we look at a sample album and some of that storytelling? How about we look at the consistency and the quality? And we show the bride and groom why they must have an album. So this is a wedding that we photographed in Lake Como several years ago. And I think this is key here. We make a point of showing a range of albums with a range of ages. So we don't just show the latest album that was photographed that year or the year before. We show albums that were photographed 5 or 6 years ago, like this one. Because it shows that not just our talent and our abilities and our consistency exists now and existed then and has developed over the years, but it shows that the design and the actual album is aging gracefully, and that the design, the images and the album are actually timeless, that they can enjoy the album now as though it was photographed last year. I actually challenge my brides and grooms to look at an album that's 5 or 6 years old and ask them how old they think it is. I deliberately haven't put a year on this album so it doesn't give the game away. But I usually open with an image with the bride and groom and a little title just to set the scene. And then we establish some impact in the album as well, opening with a beautiful portrait of the bride and the bride and groom on the other side. Be playful with the layout too. And I explain to them that I will be playful with the layout because I want to lead their eye around the album. I don't just want to spoon feed them the images. I want them to think about it. And when they think about it, they start to feel what's going on too. We establish some of the context, the bride getting ready. Generally, a spread would be all black and white or all colour. If a bride and groom insists on it being split in this way, then I'll have to make sure that it's balanced and it works. I think here it works because one side of the spread is black and white, the other side is colour, and they complement each other. But then this is a trick that you can play later on as well. Now, this bride's background was fashion, so she challenged me and said, I want my album to look like it's a Vogue magazine. So, challenge accepted. This is what we did. We also become product photographers as well as wedding photographers. But as wedding photographers, we're landscape photographers and we're portrait photographers. And we're photojournalists. Here, so I'm setting the scene. We've got the shoes, so it becomes a product shoot. I've posed the bride once she's ready, so that's her fashion portrait shot. Then we come onto the groom. And you'll notice that I've done the same thing as I did with the bride. There are some establishing shots there which are in black and white, and there's a picture of him in colour. Be playful with the background of the page as well. Alternate the stroke around the image. This is all about the impact and the storytelling and the effectiveness of the storytelling. Ultimately, it's there to draw the eye in particular places, around each image, around each page, around the entire spread. And you want to keep the viewer engaged all the way through, and that's part of the storytelling as well. We become landscape photographers. Again, we're establishing the context here, his arrival, and then her arrival, just to balance this. He's already waiting at the altar. If you've ever been to Lake Como, you'll know it's very windy. So as she approached and she was taking the veil off, her veil blew backwards. And it created some amazing expressions, which we're there to capture and to encapsulate in the story. Notice also consistency in post-production, in colour, in the look, the feel, in the scale of objects in all the images, so that they're not distracting, so that your eye is led around progressively. Your eye shouldn't be jarred at some point by something that doesn't fit. So suddenly shifting colour quality and colour consistency, suddenly shifting from a short depth of field image to a long depth of field image, or from a bright image to a dark image, will just stop the eye at that point, and it becomes a distraction, and it spoils the experience for the viewer. So if you can make an entire spread black and white, then try and do that. Notice also the scale I mentioned earlier on. It's important that the scale flows and it makes sense in the context of what's going on in the, not just the page, but the entire spread. That continues all the way through. And the color consistency between pages, between spreads, is important. They all need to feel that they belong together, not just on a page, not just on a spread, but in the entire album. But then as we move on from the more documentary images to the portrait images, that consistency should still exist. It should be easy to appreciate and easy to enjoy this album. And there shouldn't be a sudden shift in style. So all of these portrait images, these hero images, could easily be mixed into the photojournalistic images just in terms of look and feel. It's not something that I would recommend. But as the couple, as your bride and groom, as your clients turn the pages, it should flow. There shouldn't be a sudden step in the flow of the images. There shouldn't be a sudden step in the impact of the images. There should be a smooth transition so that they can enjoy what's happening in the image. They can enjoy the impact of the beauty, the posing, the lighting, all of the effort that you've placed in creating and curating this amazing album. The whole point of this is to convince them ultimately that your work, the story, their story, this beautifully curated sample of their life, the beginning of their family history, must be printed, and it must be printed for their future, for their children, for their grandchildren. So let's look at another album. It's a Hindu wedding, and I've opened with an introduction to the bride and groom. Now, this wedding was actually at the bride's house. They'd built this beautiful marquee where the wedding was going to take place. And again, we start with high impact images. Portrait session with the bride, and the groom had turned up late, so he had sacrificed some portrait time for himself, which is fine because I got to spend some time creating these stunning images of the bride in her lounge. Again, we talk about consistency, feel, colour, details, composition, style, approach, lighting, dynamic range, contrast. And the groom finally arrives. And he gets out of his car and gets on a horse. And rides the horse with a big procession. And again, just note how, as your eye leads from left to right across the spread, and from left to right clockwise around each image, your eyes led from image to image in a smooth, fluid way. Then we look at the establishing. Similar look and feel, similar colour tones, similar treatment all the way through. They look like they belong together on a spread, which means that they're easy to enjoy. And as the groom approaches the marquee, he's greeted by the bride's family. Now, the bride's mother had passed away when she was a teenager, so you can imagine how important these photographs are to her. The role that the mother would normally play in the ceremony, in the Hindu ceremony, was played by her two elder sisters. So photographs of her sisters, her family, her friends are immeasurable. You can't put a price on what they're worth to her. So suddenly this puts even more pressure on us to do a good job in capturing the images. But what use is all that effort if we're not going to print it and deliver it in a way that they can then cherish? They can cherish their friends and family. So moving forward, and looking at the ceremony, as the groom approaches, he crushes his ceremonial pot, which is symbolic of crushing evil. He's greeted by the bride's eldest sister, who performs a little ceremony and greets him and brings him into the marquee, just as the bride is making her approach to the marquee with her fanfare. They perform a little ceremony outside where they garland each other. This is normally done inside the canopy, but every family has slightly different customs, and this is something that these guys wanted to do, so it's important that we captured interesting angles that were consistent, so that when the images are placed together, they flow. They look like they belong together. They encapsulate the emotion and the energy of all the guests, not just the bride and the groom. So the groom finally makes his entrances, and he's walking down the long runway toward the canopy. And he's led by his entourage and the band. And before the bride makes her entrance, he sits behind a ceremonial sheet, which then comes down when he's ready to greet the bride. But while he's there, he's having a quick selfie with his friends. They had no idea I was taking this photograph, but they'll cherish this picture, not just the groom, but the groom and all of his friends, because it was a natural moment. It's something that they were having fun with, that no one else was supposed to see. It was behind the sheet, but it was captured and put in the wedding album. Capturing some details of the groom waiting in anticipation, and then the priest announcing that the bride is making her entrance. So finally the bride walks down the aisle. She's being led by her two uncles. Her father is waiting at the end next to the groom to perform the ceremony along with the sisters. So this is her view walking up. And then my view looking down across the sheet, splitting the view of the bride and groom, everyone waiting for things to begin. The groom's waiting in anticipation for the sheet to come down so that he can actually finally get married to his beautiful bride. So we speak about photojournalism and we speak about portraits, and then somewhere in between there are candid shots and there's documentary, and then somewhere in the middle of that are moment-driven portraits. So these are images that look like they could be portraits but are just in the moment, and this is framing through things, vignetting through objects or through people, picking the right lens so that it's flattering, picking the right angles so that it's flattering, picking the right moment so that it's engaging. Storytelling of the family and the friends, watching the guests. These are all important people. Watching what's about to happen, trying to look on and actually catch a glimpse of the bride's sultry expression at this point. Then they finally get to garland each other, And prime examples of moment-driven portraits. If you look on the right-hand side, it's a beautiful picture of the bride. This is a fleeting moment. These things happen in split seconds. And you can see the smile on her face, knowing that he's about to garland her and the ceremony is about to begin. And there are lots of details that need to be captured. So as photographers, we work very hard to go macro and micro, zoom in and out, and capture lots of details all the way through. And all the people that are involved in this. I think very few people, particularly new brides and grooms, they don't really appreciate necessarily just how broad and tight our view needs to be at the same time. Just how technical and creative we need to be at the same time. Just how we need to be able to tell stories and control our own emotion and pour our own emotion into creating those stories in the first place. But also how we need to be psychologists and get to know the people that are involved and understand what makes them tick and understand what's going to appeal to them. And we have to do this in a split second when we're creating each image. But then we have to think about how all these images sit side by side when we're curating this story in an album. So when you build this up in this way and they begin to understand that the album is actually priceless, you put a lot of work into telling their story. The only thing left to do is for them to commit and print it. So then as wedding continues, there are more details, more moment-driven portraits. The eyes say everything. And in fact, that image means a lot to the groom as well as to the bride. The bride loves it because it makes her look beautiful. The groom loves it because he can see what she feels about him in her eyes. And these are stories that we need to tell to the brides and grooms so that they understand the narrative. They understand what we were seeing and feeling when we were creating these images. Our images are our language. We speak different languages. I speak English, I speak various other languages, but I also speak through my imagery. We all have slightly different dialects, and we all have slightly different accents in our style of photography. And it's our job to portray that and convey this. So through more details on the left-hand side, you can see that the family are tying a rope around the couple, literally tying them together. And we can shift focus from the bride to the rope in the foreground, and this is the sister holding onto it, so it has symbolic value. And then shifting angle, and then capturing that beautiful expression, beautiful eyes on the bride. And then the ceremonial fire, this is the core, the crux of the ceremony. All the people watching, getting involved. As the bride and groom actually conduct this part of the ceremony, they walk around this fire 4 times. So here you can see that the groom is taking the bride's hand. It's symbolic because he leads the first 3 and then she leads the final one. More on the ceremonial fire. And these items that they place in the fire are put in their hands by the brothers of the bride. So the photographs on the right show those members of the family getting involved. Again, priceless moments for them. And then we come up to the end of the ceremony where the groom is spiritually and metaphorically marking his territory. So he ties, in that first of 3 images on the right hand side, he ties a necklace around her which she has to wear all the time. It signifies that she's married. And then he places a red vermilion stripe in the parting in her hair, which is a warning to other men that this lady's taken. Again, symbolic, playful, and beautiful at the same time. Now as they close, they make their vows in these 7 steps. So they touch their feet on these little stones. With each touch of each stone, it's a step. And each step is a vow. So they make 7 vows to each other. It's a beautiful moment. It's very symbolic. Her feet are decorated. And the friends and the family, they throw rice with each step. So these images are loaded symbolically, creatively, technically, beautifully. Let's not forget the portraits, the family portraits, the formals. These may not be the most interesting pictures for most people. They may not make most people's websites or Instagram feeds. But they're just as important to the friends and family as the storytelling images and the portraits, the couple's portraits. So we put a lot of effort into creating these images. We clean up the scene, We light it like it's in a studio. We pose everybody carefully, and we take 3 pictures of every shot just in case people blink. And we explain this process to our brides and grooms. Again, it's establishing the scene. It's establishing the effort that goes into it, and it's planting seeds for them to actually just believe that these images need to be immortalized and not live on a hard drive somewhere. So as the ceremony comes to a close, there's more emotion, there's tears, they're saying goodbye to the family. But just before they leave, there's some fun and games where they steal the groom's shoes and he needs to buy them back. He's not allowed to leave until he's actually paid for them, or he's not allowed to leave until he's wearing his shoes. So in order to wear them, he needs to buy them back if they've stolen them. And they did quite a good job here. They all got involved. And finally, they get in the car, and there's a final ceremony that happens where normally the bride's mother would see them off. And here, obviously, the sisters are involved in this. All the friends and family around saying bye. It's lots of energy, it's lots of emotion, but beautiful details. And you'll notice that the density of the images on the spreads increase as the album progresses, because you can build it up. If you begin an album design with high density, it becomes difficult to follow. So I would recommend starting with fewer images on a spread at the beginning, and then slowly ramping it up toward the end. Then you can get away with having more images, because by this point they're really drawn into the story, and they're understanding the flow, your narrative. They're understanding your style of telling the images. They're beginning to already appreciate and buy into the flow that you created, the flow that you've designed across all of these beautiful spreads. And then we close with a portrait of the bride and groom together. So, I have to ask, why do you print? Well, we've spoken about that in great detail today. But just to reiterate, it is about profit ultimately. It's about their memories, for sure. And I think that makes up the biggest part of it. But if you're not running a business to make profit, then why are you running a business? None of us should be doing this for free. We can't live for free. So, printing an album is key for the survival of our business. Our photography businesses rely on album print sales for survival. It also provides an avenue for referrals, because when you deliver you unveil the album initially and you deliver this album, they're going to be proud. They'll want to show it off to everybody, and they'll speak about you. They'll speak about you highly, because you would have created an amazing impact. You could even brand the album, which helps. So there is that subtle avenue of upselling just through referral, with just by them owning the album. If you explain your approach and your raison d'etre to your clients to begin with from the start, it becomes easier for them to buy into this. It becomes easier for them to understand why you do what you do. It becomes easier for them to understand your strategies and your way of working on the day, your processes afterwards, the amount of effort that you put into the post-production for the album in creating the consistency. Perhaps like me, you retouch every single picture that goes into the album after you've equalized the colors, the tones, the exposures, that dynamic range, the contrasts, the overall feel. After you've curated the look and the feel of the album, the scale, how you've cropped the images within the frames in the album design, just so that it's easy for the eyes to scan across. When they understand how much time and effort and thought and care you put into this, they'll understand the value to you, and therefore they'll begin to understand the value of what the album will mean to them. A good client will understand your motivations and your work ethic. So don't be afraid to spend time explaining it to them. Albums and upgrades may cost thousands of pounds now, or dollars. But at that stage, it's a figure. And if they've been listening to what you've been saying, if they believe in your stories, and if they can actually follow your approach, if they value photography, they'll realize that price now is one thing and value later is an entirely different thing altogether. It's going to be priceless to them. They just don't know it yet. So, just to wrap up with a story of a bride who, during the wedding, had no idea that her mother had terminal cancer. The mother had kept it from her just to protect the bride's experience for the wedding. The bride had gone on honeymoon, still didn't know. She'd come back, and then the mother broke the news to her. And then she called us up instantly and said, I need photos. And I need some printed photos to give to my mum so she can see the wedding in printed form before she leaves us. But then also those images would serve another reminder to the bride that this is what the mother got to experience, the joy and the emotion through all the pain of her disease. So if I were to take those prints away from her and tear them up in her face, you can imagine the shock and the horror she would feel, because she now has an attachment to those prints. They have a value for her. It was the last thing her mother saw. It was the last bit of joy her mother experienced before she passed on. But also just consider that the first thing that the bride reached for were images, and images of her mother as well, which she will frame and cherish. So don't undervalue or don't underestimate the value of the images and the prints, and please be sure to convey that to your brides and grooms. So it's very important that you use good quality paper, good quality printing to be able to portray all of this work and all of your effort and your narrative, your story of them, so that they can enjoy it in the future, so it lasts that time. So until next time, have fun printing, good luck, and hope to see you soon.